would close it out and move on. Is that the right thing to do? So was the analyst actually wrong? They followed their procedural steps. They followed the rinse and repeat, cut and dry, copy paste style of analysis they probably follow for every investigation because their organization says these are the steps you must follow. So is the analyst to blame, or are the box checking styles of analysis the root cause? I mean, maybe it's the organization, like I mentioned, locking them into procedural methods. These analytical methodologies should be able to be dynamic. They shouldn't be cut and dry like this. So why do we lock them in these analytical procedural boxes? Shouldn't we empower them to think just a little bit differently? So let's kind of run it again with a without the limiting factors of a checkbox style of methodology. So we'll empower the analyst to think a little bit more freely, and approach each data point in the investigation in a dynamic way. So let's get our Sherlock Holmes hat, our thinking hat on, and get to it. All right, so imagine that the first run-through was actually fairly accurate. They followed the steps that they were told to follow. They verified none of the data was actually malicious, right? Except for maybe that code. So not exactly. Based on the code, if you were actually to perform analysis on the blob of data you found in the PCAP, you might actually find something. So taking a step outside the old methodology, we can come to the conclusion that there may be some level of encoding at play. So maybe it's hex or base 64 encoding. If you were able to see it a little bit more clearly, you could see that the letters actually go beyond what's allowed for hexadecimal or base 16. We know that ends at the character F. So we can see there's actually a P there. So we could probably assume it's some other level of encoding. So we'll run it through some tools. Maybe base 64 decoder, a simple one online, or CyberChef, which is my favorite. If you don't know about that website, it's a great resource for when you're doing analysis. Allows you to decode, encode, sometimes decrypt if you have the keys available, etc. So maybe your security devices actually have some type of decoding feature in them. I know a lot of them do, like Blue Coat Proxy and etc. have stuff like that, but are they going to actually do it to the level you need in order to solve the problem that's in front of you? So now we're cooking. This code starts to become apparent after we base 64 decoded it. And we can assume that this triggered from web traffic, and as you can see on here, it's definitely a JavaScript file. So could it be malicious? Or could it just be simply just a random JavaScript file like there is on every single web page out there today? But I do think we're onto something here. As you can see, there's still some level of encoding at play. As you can see, there's two variables here with random digit numbers along with long strings. And if you look really closely, you can see that these don't go beyond F. So we can assume that's probably base 16 or hexadecimal. So of course the plot thickens because there's a lot more at play than we thought. So after using a tool such as CyberChef or your base 16 decoder, we can actually figure out what's going on in the script. Now for simplicity's sake for the presentation, the first variable is actually a link to maliciousdomain.com/backdoor.exe. If it's ever that clear in the real world, I think you're doing great. So it looks like there's also a target-destination.com. We can assume that a user probably clicked on a link. They thought they were going to target-destination.com. And if an analyst doesn't really know anything about JavaScript, if it's really obfuscated to a certain extent, they may be wondering what the heck to do. And of course, that's where we break out our own Google foo or Google skills to figure out what's actually going on in this script. But it's in plain English. We can see that there is some level of redirection at play here, and the location.ref, if you're familiar with JavaScript at all. But if not, that's what Google is for. So using Google, we can actually figure out that it's attempting to redirect the user. So it may not have been obvious in the beginning to most analysts, or most tier 1 analysts in the beginning, but a certain level of obfuscation was being used in the script. So obfuscation. What is obfuscation? How should we deal with it as analysts? Or how should we approach these types of problems? So according to techtarget.com, if they're a reliable source, obfuscation is the practice of making something difficult to understand. Programming code is often obfuscated to protect intellectual property and prevent an attacker from reverse engineering a proprietary software. So, like with every piece of technology developed for a good purpose, someone has probably weaponized it, right? So let's go over a few examples of good things that were actually turned and used for bad purposes. So DNS being used for command and control. I can't even count the number of times I came across an alert or an event that was triggered on a malicious DNS query because the first part of the DNS query was actually base 64 encoded, and once decoded, you could see that it was going out to several foreign nations or known command and control servers operated by certain APTs. I won't say too many for classified purposes. And there's what's called inter-protocol exploitation. This one's actually really cool, and I learned about during my web app pen test training. Basically, inter-protocol exploitation is you're exploiting one protocol through the means of another. So for example, let's say that you're doing a whois search on a potentially malicious domain, and you want to get all the records, the text records, etc. And so you select text record, and all of a sudden a script pops up or a window pops up. What's going on? Well, it turns out that it was discovered a few years ago that if you embed a link or a URL address to a script inside your DNS text record, you could actually trigger some form of cross-site scripting on the individual who searched your text record. So basically you're using DNS means to exploit on HTTP. And of course there are tons of examples out there of good things being used for nefarious purposes. So given enough time, an analyst could attempt to reverse engineer a piece of obfuscated code, but to be honest, a tier 1 analyst isn't going to have time for that because their organization is most likely having them work X number of alerts per hour, or when it comes down to it, it's really just a numbers game. But it is possible. It's not simple, but they could follow the breadcrumbs. Depending on the level of complexity, it may take time. But I've seen certain levels of obfuscation where each random, or every other character was replaced with a period or a slash. And that really takes some time to reverse engineer things like that. So on the initial run through, the first part of the investigation, it was fairly straightforward. The analyst was limited to some very restrictive guidelines as far as their procedural methods go, and a simple methodology was at play. It wasn't really anything detailed. They didn't dive into each data point like they should have. So this approach really operates along the lines of assuming that the malicious actions are going to jump right out at you, which is rarely the case. And if it is, you've gotten pretty lucky in your analysis game. So a simple analytical methodology may work sometimes. I'm not going to say it's going to work 100% of the time. It maybe for your organization, it works 50% of the time. Maybe it works 80% of the time. But it's probably not the case when it comes down to the real deal stuff, such as APTs attempting to conduct lateral movement on your network and stuff like that. But of course, that's putting a lot of faith in the tuning of your security devices. Unless you're running some fancy AI, machine learning, behavioral analytics device or network on your actual SIEM that's taking in all that data from your security devices, you're probably not going to be able to find stuff like this that's multiple levels of obfuscation conducting nefarious actions against your network. So the final run through. It started the same way as our first run through, right? The answer wasn't blatantly obvious as we saw multiple levels of obfuscation at play. So we had to apply a different methodology. Now, there's not going to be one methodology that fits all types of investigations. But we followed the breadcrumbs, which led to our final result. The way I think about an investigation at each data point is what I like to call stepping off points. Basically, a stepping off point should be any piece of data that comes up in an investigation. And that data should, of course, spawn more questions, and the data analyzed from answering those questions should lead to analysis-driven results. And of course, this should feed back into that starting point to see if it needs to be run through again, or if it simply just needs to be added back to the investigation, or if it was a waste of time. But you won't know until you actually perform detailed analysis on each data point allowed. So the question is, can you follow the breadcrumbs? It's going to be rare that an advanced attacker, such as an APT or some type of hacking group, is going to leave behind simple breadcrumbs. That's, of course, unless they're wanting you to see those things. So the threats facing your organization and my organization, they aren't adhering to limiting guidelines. Sure, every military operation has guidelines that they have to follow, but they're going to try whatever possible to complete their objectives. And they aren't locking themselves into a procedural box or a procedural thinking method. So the question is, why should we? Allowing our analysts to think outside the box can greatly increase the odds of identifying nefarious actions. So, putting the puzzle together. As analysts or investigators, we're often tasked with putting pieces of various types and amounts of data together to create an understandable picture of the events that led to an alert. This often can be time-consuming and require you to think a certain way, as we mentioned, thinking a little bit more outside the box. So an example of what really drove this presentation, I'll go and put all the information on there, was I was working as an analyst when I first started, and a fellow analyst comes over and asks me to help out. He says, you know, it's flagging, but I can't figure out what's going on. So I follow my procedural steps. I check the IPs, URLs, nothing seems odd here. I look through correlated events to see if there's anything flagged, nothing in our historical records. But in the PCAP, just like in our investigation earlier, there was some type of obfuscated code at play. So after base64 decoding it, I found out it was JavaScript, which fortunately I knew a little bit of JavaScript at the time. And you could see there were URLs encoded in hex, just like in our early investigation. Decoded those, and running through the code and really analyzing what's going on, it turned out to be some form of cryptojacking malware. And what's funny, of all places, it was on a baking site for a breadcrumb recipe. And so I never thought as an analyst I would be analyzing malware on a baking site. Especially working like for the Air Force, like you think our focus would be on, you know, military websites, but turns out we have users just like in every other organization that browse through random websites. So the end game, what have we actually learned here? I know we didn't really go into too much detail on these investigations, but that was really on purpose. It was really to help you think that, or realize that you need to approach every investigation in a dynamic manner. Our methods, of course, should be adaptable to the information that we have available to us, just with our stepping off points on each point in the data, or each point in the investigation. And of course, there's no way our security devices are going to detect everything, unless, you know, of course, you got that crazy AI, machine learning infused behavioral analytics machine, which probably costs billions of dollars. So that's where we as the analysts come in, or the investigators, the incident responders. It's truly up to us to drill down and find out if this alert was actually malicious, or if it was simply just noise in the scene. So the question is, are you employing the correct analytical methodology? Like I said before, the best methodology is the one that is fluid and can be implemented into every step in an investigation. And there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all here. And that's really what it comes down to, is what works for your organization. All right, so in the spirit of SAINTCON, what's called the Breadcrumb Challenge. So you may have noticed that there was hex on each slide. The challenge is, of course, can you figure out what is actually going on with that hex? And the first individual to contact me on Twitter will actually get a copy of the Blue Team Field Manual, which is a really fun book. It's a great starting point for investigations and such, especially on the host level. So that's 2 underscores. It's going to be at 5 special, so special with a 5, underscore, underscore, capital K via Twitter. So any questions? All right, perfect. So if you want to talk after this, come on up. I'll leave this up for a second, so if you want to write it down, you want to send me the results to the quiz. Probably give you guys until the end of the day. I'll be in the area around the conference, so feel free to tweet me. Thank you.
Did it turn on? Yeah. It's not working? Test. There we go. That's on. Wait, you should be good. Yep.
Cool. So we have 4 minutes.